One day I came across a picture that had sat forever on the dining room wall of my childhood home in the Toronto Star. It was of my great-grandmother and her children the day of my great-grandfather's funeral. The article focused on how people of African descent know very little about their family history. Our ancestors were afraid if they told their stories, they would face persecution or be sent back into slavery. Almost 100 years later, we are still afraid to tell our stories. Every spring, when the weather gets warm, I hold my breath hoping that the shootings won't start this time. But they do. Last year, a young man who was well known in the community was killed execution style on the hill behind the primary school in broad daylight. Days later, I was at a safety meeting. The image that stays with me to this day is of continuous interruptions of traumatized residents. My chest tightens each time they tell me their stories. I knew exactly how they felt. Many had been offered crisis response support, but they needed more for the days, months, and years to follow. At the time, my youngest daughter was attending First Nations School of Toronto. I learned that First Nations people use healing circles to help their community. I felt that they may help us in ours, so I took the time to research and design a healing circle project for the Lawrence Heights Neptune community. The first time I was the keeper of a circle, I was amazed to see 29 participants show up, and 12 were youth. I started by sharing my story about being the only Black family growing up in rural Ontario, how we were the only ones to have to pay to get on the school bus, and being forced to read Little Black Sambo in class. I told them how my parents fought to change these racist policies. I also told them about how I was impacted by the shootings, the ones I witnessed, and the young men I knew. My stories open up the space for participants to share. They share stories of how they had to send their sons to live outside the community to keep them safe, how bullets had passed through their windows as they were eating or sleeping, and sadly, of how they had to provide CPR to a dying child. It reminded me that when we don't tell our stories, we only harbor fear. But when we do, we relinquish that fear and heal our communities.